So, I'm Anya Schifrin, and I'm the director of the International Media Advocacy and Communications program here at SEPA. And it's a small program, actually getting bigger, with about 50 students and 14 courses. And I'm the person that organized this conference with help from Matt Walter, who's somewhere in the audience. We have a really busy day, so I hope you've all got agendas and bios of all the speakers. And I'll just talk a little bit about the conference and how it came to be before we continue with Arianna Huffington and Bill Gruskin. For me, it's been fantastic to see all the enthusiasm. We've had so many people say that they wanted to come and wanted to be on panels. And for me, in a way, the roots of this conference actually come from the time that I spent in Hanoi in the late 90s. I arrived the day the Thai baht collapsed, and that was really the start of the Asian crisis. And I was there for the first 2 years of the crisis. And it was very interesting working as a reporter in a place where the media is controlled by the Communist Party and the government, as one of our panelists, Rich Chua, knows very well, because he was there even before I was. And there was a lot of uncertainty in Vietnam about the crisis and how much Vietnam would be affected. Since it was such a closed economy, people hoped that it wouldn't be. And like many countries, Vietnam had a banking crisis and got a lot of advice from the IMF and the World Bank about how they should treat that crisis. And the way they handled the crisis in the first instance was a couple of months before I arrived, the Politburo made it illegal to write about banking. And they also made non-performing loans a state secret. Those were classified as a state secret. So as you can imagine, they were very afraid of bank runs and a loss of confidence in their very frail banking sector. And so as you can imagine, we really worked in an atmosphere of secrecy, which was particularly hard on the Vietnamese journalists because they had often more information than the foreign reporters did, but they couldn't report on what they found out. And there was a sort of climate of fear in which people were afraid to tell things. And as you know, when no one's sure what the line is, they censor themselves even more. So when the US financial crisis started here, I did actually see a few points in common with the situation in Vietnam, strangely. There was that fear of undermining confidence by printing bad news. There was the usual sort of spinning and pressure from people in government, and even some cases readers, not to report bad news. There was that collapse in advertising revenues, which in our case, preceded the crisis, but has been aggravated in this country by the economic downturn. And then there were the ensuing layoffs and job cuts that made journalists more, afraid of their jobs and perhaps a little bit more afraid of standing out from the pack and reporting in an unusual way. But at the same time, new opportunities opened up for business and economic journalists. Those of us who sort of worked in the coal face of the news wires know that you spend a lot of time sort of toiling away, doing routine earnings stories and market reports that sort of get buried on the back pages. But all of a sudden during a crisis, everyone gets interested in business and the economy. And so it's also kind of exciting time for business journalists. And there's a chance to write all the stories that are usually shunted aside. Detailed explainers of different financial instruments and how they work, and the chance to write about real people, which is why Peter Goodman is here today. So we've seen that too during this crisis. So all of a sudden there's all kinds of stories and reporting that we might not normally see on the business pages. So these were the impressions that I had when I started thinking about this economic crisis and how it was affecting journalists here. And we began doing academic research to see what had been written on the subject. And there was actually very, very little. There's a lot that's been done on the political press and crises, but really little done on economic crises and what happens to journalism. I did find one very interesting paper about Korea in '97, and that confirmed pretty much everything that I had thought. I had a hunch. Certainly what happens is that after bubbles burst, such as the dot-com collapse of the late 90s, which Gary Rivlin, who's in the audience, covered very well, the Enron collapse, the press begins a sort of period of soul-searching and beating themselves up and wondering, should we have seen it coming earlier? our fault for not warning people. And then you sort of see a flurry in the trade press of pieces about that. And Scott Sherman, who's in the audience, did the sort of definitive piece on Enron for Columbia Journalism Review a few years ago. And Dean Starkman's been doing pieces about this crisis and should journalists have seen it coming for CJR and Mother Jones. But some time has passed since the economic crisis started, and so I thought it would be a good time to revisit the topic. As we know, things have gotten even gloomier for the media since the crisis started. Advertising last year fell more than at any time since the Great Depression. Paper Cuts estimates that there were 15,000 job losses last year in the United States at newspapers. And in that terrific report by Leonard Downey Jr. and Michael Schudson, which the journalism school released in the fall, they said that, according to various studies, the number of newspaper editorial employees, which had grown from about 40,000 in 1971 to more than 60,000 in 92, had fallen back to around 40,000 in 2009. So at the same time, of course, we've seen the growth of the internet and the blogosphere. And so I wanted to organize a conference that would look at some of these trends. There's been a lot of conferences on this topic already. Steve Schiffers from City University in London, Dean Starkman at the Audit has organized meetings like that. So what I thought I would do for this conference would be bring in some of the voices that we actually haven't heard in this debate. So I'm really happy today because we've got people from different NGOs and consumer groups, and we've got a whole panel on journalism from around the world, where we have journalists from Africa and Egypt and China, as well as from Europe, who will be talking about the effect that crisis had on them. We're also, a little self-promotion, we're putting together a book on the press and the financial crisis, and some of the contributors are here today speaking on the different panels, so we're very excited about that as well. When I approached Roosevelt last fall, they immediately agreed to fund this event, so I need to thank Andrew Rich and Rob Johnson, who were really instrumental in organizing this. Rob, unfortunately, is in England today for another event there, so I'd like to thank everyone from Roosevelt and also some of my own colleagues, such as Robin Stevenson, who actually thought of the nifty title for this conference. We've got loads of students and alumni who've been corralled into working today, so if you need to know, where to get coffee or where the bathrooms are, they're around looking very officious and efficient, so you can ask them. I think they're all out front right now. And when I got started planning, I went around New York and talked to all kinds of different people to get their ideas. So again, Scott Sherman, Julia Angwin, Christine Harper from Bloomberg, Robert Friedman from Bloomberg, Bill Gruskin, Nick Lemon, and a lot of the people who were nice, no good deed goes unpunished. So a lot of the people who were nice enough to talk to me and give me advice about the conference then got corralled into being in the conference. I don't know if they're here yet, but I was really excited that some of the most senior people in our field have agreed to fly in from all over the country to come here. So Steve Clements from New America Foundation, Bob Giles and Barry Sussman from Neiman Watchdog Project, and I'm really hoping that they'll be very active participants as well. And above all, I don't think that Dean Starkman's actually here yet, but that's too bad because he's going to miss my heartfelt thanks. I just want to say that anyone who's organizing a conference really needs a conference buddy who they can call up in moments of crisis, and I was really lucky to have Dean Starkman as mine. As you all know, he runs the Audit for Columbia Journalism Review. I think his media criticism for business journalism is something that not a lot of people are doing. And when I approached Dean, he was very enthusiastic and really agreed to help. So he's been fantastic, and I'm sorry he's not here, but maybe we can applaud him later. I'll just give you briefly Andrew Rich, President and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, and then we will continue with Dean Gruskin and Arianna Huffington.
Good morning. I just want to add my welcome to Anya's. The Roosevelt Institute is a think tank. We're a policy and leadership development organization. We're based here in New York City, and we have offices in Washington, D.C., and we have offices up in Hyde Park, New York, where we're actually the nonprofit partner to the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. And we are focused on developing leaders and ideas that carry forward the values and the spirit of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, progressive values. We launched the think tank portion of our work just about a year ago when I started. I started at the Institute a year ago in January. We started with think tank work at that moment, and the first area of interest for us was financial reform. And we've been working with Rob Johnson, as Anya mentioned, who was a former chief economist of the Senate Banking Committee, with Joe Stiglitz, with Elizabeth Warren, who's been pushing so valiantly for the Consumer Protection Agency in Washington. We launched a blog, New Deal 2.0. that Lynn Paramore, who's going to be on one of the panels, has done a wonderful job of editing, and we've attracted folks who are really at the intersection of scholarship, practice, and journalism. Jeff Madrick is a senior fellow with us, and you'll hear from him later. And what we've been trying to do is to build community, build trust among a set of folks who care about issues of financial reform, and frankly encourage greater levels of courage so that people then become stronger voices in the debate around how financial reform should look in this country and how the future of this economy and the global economy should look. And it's been kind of tough. This is an issue, and frankly this is the reason why we started with it, this is an issue that had very little policy, political, or journalistic capacity in this country, I think, when we started a year ago and when the country was experiencing a financial collapse. Interestingly enough, it's an issue that we created relatively solid financial regulation for during the Roosevelt presidency in the 1930s, and as a consequence of that, because we had relatively stable financial markets over a 50-year period until there was this erosion of financial regulation, we hadn't actually developed policy capacity, think tanks, advocates, media efforts, grassroots organizers who were really interested in working on this issue. And so the efforts that have been underway, not just by the Roosevelt Institute, but by a wide range of those who are going to be part of this conference and are part of really the national discussions on this issue, are new and have taken on great energy, but it's been tough. There wasn't enough capacity. You're up against some fierce opponents, in a sense, when it comes to financial regulations with the big banks. And it's a hard issue for the public to understand. We look to think tanks to add some understanding. We look to scholars. We look to practitioners. And then, of course, we look to journalists. And so we were excited when Anya came to us 6 months ago, I guess, and spoke with Rob Johnson and me about doing this conference together, excited about really exploring what the progress is in financial journalism as it relates to the economic crisis. And so I'm excited to be here. The Roosevelt Institute's excited to be a partner in it. I'm particularly thrilled that we have students from one of our 86 chapters of the Roosevelt Institute Campus Network present, where we're building new leaders and new ideas. And I think it's going to be a fascinating day in discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. So Arianna Huffington is, of course, one of those speakers who needs no introduction. All you young people in the room will know her as the founder of the Huffington Post, but those of us of a certain age have known her work for many decades. Even before launching one of the most famous websites in the country, she was a noted biographer and writer, has run for public office. And the Huffington Post is an interesting topic for today's conference because it's part of a new style of media, one that stresses commentary opinion and which stands behind the mainstream media, sort of commenting and critiquing it. So we're really looking forward to her insights today. And we're also very lucky to have Dean Bill Ruskin with us. He came to Columbia Journalism School after many years at the Wall Street Journal, including time as deputy page one editor, where I really think some of the, having been edited by them, I do think they're some of the finest editors in the world, actually. And he was also deputy managing editor of news, too, as well, for the Journal. As Dean of Academic Affairs at the Journalism School, he's been a key part of the constant renewal of the curriculum that Dean Nick Lemon has done during his tenure. He's brought a lot of new ideas and great vision to Columbia. So thank you very much. We look forward to your conversation.
Right. Thank you. It's good to have you here, Arianna. Thank you for coming. So I thought what I'd do is I just kind of give a little shtick about how the hour will go, and an hour, I think, is about what we have. I'm going to ask Arianna a few questions, both about the financial crisis, but also I think people are interested in Huffington Post as the Huffington Post and kind of how it's doing and where you see the future. And we'll do that for about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up to your questions. And I assume this is one of those conferences where if you're going to ask a question, you have to promise to speak into the microphone or you'll get hauled away with the news or something like that. So I'd like to start, Arianna, by just asking you to kind of put the rewind button on to the weekend in September of 2008, when it looked like the whole world was falling apart, when Lehman Brothers was going down, and it looked like it was going to take the entire financial system down with it. And you, as the editor of this incredibly powerful and growing site, what was going through your mind in terms of kind of where do we go on this huge story where there's so many sources of information?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. I want to thank Anya and my friends at the Roosevelt Institute for putting this together. It's incredibly important and overdue. And I'm delighted also to see the Huffington Post media editor, Jason Lincoln's here, who's done some great writing on the subject, incidentally. So going back to that weekend, I remember the moment when online we suddenly saw the Paulson memo about what the bailout would be like. And I don't know if you remember, the original memo was really stunning because it was basically saying that there was going to be no oversight, that basically this crisis was so great that Congress should surrender everything and just allow whatever Henry Paulson and his people decided to do to be the law of the land. And that we splashed that immediately. And I remember getting emails from friends of mine in Wall Street saying, what you're doing is irresponsible, this is a major crisis for the country. It was exactly what Anya described about this immediate fear that somehow Wall Street was going to collapse because of the coverage. You know, there is this Wall Street image as kind of Victorian ladies who take to the fainting couch. You know, immediately there is anything said that is disturbing or any bad news. Wall Street cannot handle bad news. That's the assumption. So there was tremendous pressure both on us and I'm sure on everyone else doing coverage at the time to just not really report what the original Paulson plan was, which, as you know, in the end was not the ultimate Paulson plan. But even in the distance we traveled from the original Paulson plan to the final one, the overwhelming tendency in the coverage that we tried to fight against on HuffPost was that this was so overwhelming that basically whatever the experts said should go. And so it was a constant battle to not allow the experts to hide behind complexity, to hide behind the assumption. This is so complicated. You know, ordinary people cannot possibly understand or have a valid opinion. And, you know, for a long time, I was wondering why I ever got a master's in economics at Cambridge, because I never did anything with it. As Anya said, I wrote biographies of Pablo Picasso and Maria Callas, for which you did not need a master's in economics. And that was the moment when it came in handy, because it gave me a certain sort of trust in my own judgment that, you know, these things are not really that complicated. Kind of we learned about them in Economics 101 at school. And what was complicated was all the additional architecture that was built on top of them.
So can you take us, since the Huffington Post has a very different structure from what a legacy media company has. If you're the business editor of the New York Times or the deputy managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, you have this cadre of beat reporters that you're going to send out to cover it. Obviously, the Huffington Post has a very different model. And if you could kind of take us through how you got content onto your site. Were you going to independent bloggers? Were you using your own staff to curate information? How did you go about dealing with this massive story?
We really have three ways to get information on the site. The first is deciding what stories we're going to aggregate. Mm-hmm. So what stories and what paragraphs of what stories we're going to splash. That's number one decision, because as I.F. Stone said, the interesting thing in Washington is what page of the Washington Post the number one page story is going to be on. So we kind of decide what is the important story at each moment, and it may be paragraph 13 of a story on page 21 of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. But by splashing it, we immediately give it a kind of value that, because of our traffic now and because we are bookmarked by others in the media, gives it a kind of resonance that otherwise it wouldn't have. So that's the first way. The second way is through our bloggers. We have about 3,000 bloggers who have their own password. These are both well-known figures and not so well-known, but people we trust, whose opinions, whether we agree with them or not, we value, and who therefore can post on the site by themselves. But then our editors decide which of these they're going to front page. And that's, of course, what gives them the oxygen and the opportunity to be heard and read by many. Yeah. So, and also, of course, we can go out and invite people to blog. as we did with Joe Stiglitz and Nouriel Roubini and people who at the time were sort of sage voices that we wanted our readers to hear from. And the final thing is we have a small reporting team in Washington and in New York, and we would discuss with them what they're going to be covering, what are the most important areas to cover, and Jason takes the lead at covering the media coverage, which is also very important in terms of the echo chamber effect of kind of putting the spotlight on the ways the media are covering stories.
So take us into the number 2, which I think is very interesting to a lot of people. You have thousands of bloggers out there who they can post anything they want on Huffington Post at like any time, and it doesn't go through any kind of filter or anything along those lines.
Those particular ones. We also have thousands who submit to us who don't have their own password, and those are evaluated.
But the people who have the password, those number in the thousands.
Right.
How did you feel about that, especially at a moment where there's so much going on and you obviously can't be reading all of this? How did you feel about the quality and credibility of information that was being surfaced on
Well,
your
to
site?
get a password, you have to be really trusted. I mean, these are, we've only had to retract a password once. And that was because we have this very strict rule that if there is any inaccuracy in any post, the blogger has 24 hours to fix it, apologize, whatever, or their password is withdrawn. So it's only happened once, and we're going to be 5 years old on May 9th. So that's not bad.
Yeah.
That's not a bad track record. So we are very careful about who we give a password to. So we're not concerned about that. And our editors read every post before they decide to feature it.
Okay. Before it goes on.
Before it goes on
The
any of our, either the homepage, or we now have 19 sections on the Huffington Post, including a business section and a media section, and whether it goes on the homepage or in any of the verticals, somebody reads it first.
What is the difference in the amount of traffic something on the homepage gets versus something on a vertical or something buried inside?
You know, it kind of, it really depends. I mean, right now, for example, we just looked at the numbers for last week, and last week the most trafficked section on the Huffington Post was the comedy section. At other times it could be the sports section or the entertainment section. So I know that we are seen as primarily a political site, but in fact less than a quarter of our traffic comes from politics, which was something that was always what we wanted, because we didn't just want to talk to people who agree with us politically. We always wanted to talk to as large a proportion of the population as possible and expose them to how we see politics, rather than simply speaking to those who already see the world the way we see the world politically.
Right. One of the things that you've been very passionate about in your writing is how opaque and hidden a lot of the decision-making has been, both in Washington as well as on Wall Street, leading up to and following the financial crisis. As you know, online is a great medium for making opaque things transparent. What is the Huffington Post doing to sort of bring either data or decisions or hidden players involved to sort of bring them to the surface?
Well, let me give you a recent example. Simon Johnson is a contributing editor at the Huffington Post, and he helps guide our business coverage. And very often it is pulling things and giving them more oxygen, putting the spotlight on them, whatever metaphor you want to use, ahead of time. For example, when Senator Kaufman gave 3 blistering speeches on what's happening in our financial system and the need for reform, Simon kind of warned us that this was coming, started writing about it, emphasizing the elements of the Kaufman proposals that were diverging from the administration. I wrote about it. I interviewed Senator Kaufman. I called him an accidental leader, because this man who was, for those of you who don't know a lot about him, the chief of staff to Senator Biden for 20 years, succeeded him in the Senate. He's not running for re-election. He knows a lot about the financial system, and suddenly he has emerged as this crusader in the Senate. for financial reform and financial regulation, and he has truly become an accidental leader. And over the weekend, Larry Summers was praising him and saying that he agreed with him, even though, of course, the Dodd bill does not follow what Kaufman wants. But so putting the spotlight on Senator Kaufman and introducing him to the American people and introducing his ideas was something that, through the help of Simon, we are able to do ahead of time. And part of what works right now is that is being there early enough to begin to capture the public imagination, because, you know, the spotlight moves on quickly. And very soon there will be a bill in front of the president to sign, and there is only a small window of time during which the public can influence what's going to be in that bill.
Are there things that you could see either Huffington Post or other sites doing to be more of an early alarm system? I mean, obviously it's good to have the wise men and the women out there writing for your site, but are there more systematic things that either your site or other news media ought to be doing to avert this kind of catastrophe the next time around?
Well, that is such an important question. I think that is the key question. How can we, as journalists, have fewer autopsies and more biopsies? You know, how can we be an early warning system? And right now, I think the most important alarm that we need to be sounding is about what's happening in middle America, what's happening to the American middle class. That's now a personal obsession. I'm writing about it this morning on the Huffington Post. And I feel that if you look at, there are some interesting studies here, actually, the Columbia Journalism Review, Pew have done about the coverage of ordinary citizens, as opposed to, say, the coverage of business leaders and Wall Street. There's a dramatic disparity. And as a result, we don't really know in detail what's happening in people's lives. And I think that's the greatest priority right now. We cannot just look at financial reform purely in terms of Wall Street. The urgency of financial reform is not because we need to improve the ground rules on the Wall Street sandbox because things are too messy, or because we don't like excessive CEO bonuses. These are sort of marginal issues compared to the fact that we need to improve the ground rules, because the existing ground rules have had a devastating effect on the lives of millions of Americans, truly devastating. So what we are doing, about a year ago, for example, we brought on a dedicated correspondent. Remember, we have limited reporting resources, but a larger operation can have hundreds of dedicated reporters covering the stories of ordinary Americans, putting flesh and blood on the data. Arthur Delaney, who does that for us, we were going to call him our economic suffering correspondent, but that seemed a little too dreary. So we are calling him the economic impact correspondent. But, you know, he has like dozens of stories from across America that tell the story in a way that can capture the public imagination and generate empathy about what's happening. Because it's okay, it's one thing to read a Brookings Institution report about how the greatest increase in poverty is in the suburbs at the moment. But when you read about a couple that has to sell their wedding rings because that's the only way they can pay their bills, or a family that has to move out of their home and move into a motel and move their kids from their school, it has a different resonance.
Right. Are there things that you learned from covering the economic crisis that informed how you covered the lead up to and the passage of the healthcare bill? Was there anything about kind of how Washington works, or the public understanding of issues that made you all smarter about covering healthcare?
Two things. The first is that at HuffPost, you know, we don't see things as in terms of right versus left. In fact, we are obsessed with not seeing things in terms of right versus left. We have a tagline that we love to use, which we call Beyond Left and Right. So whenever, let's say, something happens that the media reflexively sees as a left versus right battle, we deliberately try to unwrap that and not see it as a left versus right battle. So when it comes to healthcare, for example, when the president made his backroom deal with pharma, this is my alarm.
Well, it's time
In
to wake
LA.
Up. Time to wake up.
This is my alarm in LA. What time is in LA? 7.
Well, we all know what time Arianna Huffington gets up in the morning, okay?
So the pharma deal, which we started reporting on really early, Sam Stein, our White House correspondent, Ryan Grimm, our congressional correspondent, did terrific reporting on this because it was very significant. There was a president who was seen as a liberal, left of center, not to mention socialist, communist president, making a deal with pharma whereby he basically gave up the right of the American people to negotiate lower prices since they have this huge bulk purchasing advantage.
Right.
Now, this is like a major free market principle, right, which the president surrendered preemptively in a back room in the White House. And we thought that this was a really bad sign about the progress. So that was very, very early on about the progress of healthcare. And so we really followed that throughout the healthcare debate. We followed also the results of the president's penchant, if you want, to try and bring all the parties together, even when there are irreconcilable interests that clearly are not going to be reconciled just because of his charm and Pied Piper abilities. And we saw the same thing with his relentless effort to convince Chad Grassley to come along, let alone Olympia Snowe. So we really covered that because you could see this was not going to work. You could see how much time was going to be wasted in this completely futile attempts at bipartisanship. And also because you can see certain things in the president's DNA that were going to influence the progress of healthcare. And it was fascinating that it was not until the end, when his back was against the wall, when it looked like everything was lost, when he changed his tone, he stopped trying to please Olympia Snowe, and he tried to communicate with the American people by telling stories, as opposed to talking about bending the cost curve. And that's when we found out about the 11-year-old boy whose mother died because of lack of health insurance, and the Ohio woman who had to give up her health insurance and was now in a hospital with leukemia. And these stories, I'm sure, helped shift the votes and the debate.
Great. So speaking of making a shift, I want to talk a little bit about the Huffington Post, or I want to hear you talk a little bit about it. You just said something interesting that you said the Huffington Post has limited reporting resources. And there was an LA Times story that said, and I don't know if this is true, it said there were about 90 employees, around 12 of whom were reporters, and the rest of whom were editors or curators. Are those numbers true? And if so, do you foresee a day where the balance starts going more like this, where you start seeing more reporters, at least as a ratio to the overall staff?
I don't know when that story was written. I'm sure at some point that was true. Now we are about 130 full-time employees, and we keep adding reporters all the time. Plus, we have the Huffington Post Investigative Fund, which is a not-for-profit operation, partly funded by the Huffington Post and partly funded by foundations like the Atlantic Philanthropies and the Schumann Foundation, and which does more sort of long-term as well as quick strike reporting, and which is based in Washington. Plus, we try to do reporting through our citizen journalists. During the campaign, we launched Off the Bus, which did some really great reporting through our 13,000 citizen journalists. And now we're calling it Eyes and Ears. And we've launched many efforts to get citizens to report on what's happening. One of them we're calling Bearing Witness 2.0, where we're having people send us stories, video about what is happening in their lives during these times of economic crisis, which is incidentally, we are living in a time of economic crisis for most Americans. And let's not forget that when we may be seeing a Dow 11,000 today, or massive profits on Wall Street. So that's something else that we are really constantly intent on reminding people on a daily basis what's happening in Main Street instead of being distracted by the success of Wall Street.
How do you see the Huffington Post's position relative to the great distress that most legacy media companies are facing right now? You see that the New York Times is about to go to a paywall system. You see under News Corp, Rupert Murdoch is extending his WSJ.com model to other properties around the world. How do you see the Huffington Post fitting into that, especially if more and more walls go up around the kind of content that you like to link to?
Oh, we are absolutely dedicated to the linked economy. Content is free. We are advertising supported. We are, in fact, last night we had a dinner with our advertising team from around the country, which is growing, and our advertising revenues are growing substantially month by month. So we are seeing this as a very healthy model. And if other legacy media like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal go behind paywalls, which I think will be a disastrous decision, will be good news for the Huffington Post, because I believe that the news consumers are very habituated at the moment to get their news for free, unless you're offering them very specialized information. I've said that before. Unless you're offering them financial information or very specialized weird porn, they won't pay for it. And I don't know why, but that's how people have grown used to consuming news. I have two daughters who are 20 and 18, and they just are used to going all over the web, having a starter site. We hope for many people it will be the Huffington Post, but whatever your starter site is, then you go around, you snack here, you snack there, you do deep dives through links. That's the brave new world, and we're not in Kansas anymore. And people who think we can go back to Kansas are really missing what is happening in the world of media.
Can you give us some sense of how much your advertising is growing? Is it growing as fast as the traffic to the site is? Because elsewhere, online advertising is in pretty deep trouble right now.
I think it's obviously very related to our traffic growth. You know, according to the ComScore numbers, we are now at 23 million unique visitors a month. And obviously that's very connected, but it's also about all the different ways in which advertisers can be involved. Through social media, for example, which more and more advertisers are trying to be part of, and the Huffington Post is constantly leading the way in our use of Facebook, Twitter. We're going to be launching Twitter editions so that people can choose Twitter editions starting this week. Our social news has been very successful, where people can decide if they want to see what their friends are reading, what their friends are commenting on. And having a very vibrant community, I think, makes a big difference. For example, we have about 2 to 3 million comments a month. And our comments are pre-moderated, so you can have a civil discussion instead of being lost in vile ad hominem attacks.
There's a new competitor on the scene called the Daily Caller, I believe, which I just took a look at it the other day. It's run by Tucker Carlson, who's pretty conservative, but when you look at it, it looks a lot like the Huffington Post. What are you? Do you see them as a competitor, or are you concerned at all about them? Do you see more aggregators along your lines popping up? That kind of
well, first of all, when the Daily Caller launched, Tucker invited me to write a piece, a Welcome to the Neighborhood piece, which I did. And that's the way I see the online universe. I think that the more people move online, the more good journalism there is online, the better it is for all of us. So it's not either or. You know, people are not going to go to the Huffington Post or to the Daily Caller, the Huffington Post or the Daily Beast. You know, it's not like buying Time or buying Newsweek. It's a very different way of consuming news. So this is really the linked economy. And so I don't see Tucker as a competitor. I sort of welcome any good journalism online, and it was Tucker who broke the RNC bondage story. Yeah. So again, I particularly love it when people don't follow this left-right ways of reporting the news. I mean, including on foreign policy. I was just doing Morning Joe today, and Joe Scarborough spent a lot of time criticizing what we are doing in Afghanistan. Now that is fantastic because, again, the media reflexively tend to look at if you are against escalating in Afghanistan, you must be a peacenik or a lefty. And they forget the fact that George Will, say, or Joe Scarborough, or major conservatives are also opposing Afghanistan. And to go back to something related to economic coverage, Jason Linkins wrote a great piece, I highly recommend, about the way the media covered the president's decision to engage in more offshore drilling. If you watched cable, and indeed the networks, about this decision, you would have no clue whether this was a good decision on its merits or a bad decision on its merits. Because the entire conversation was about the base is going to be upset, Republicans are not happy with it. There was really nothing about, is this going to really increase our energy independence? Is this really going to dramatically affect carbon emissions? You know, there was nothing about that. So that obsession is something that we need to break if we're going to have coverage that really educates the American people and advances the debate.
I have one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the crowd. You talk about the link economy, which we hear a lot about, but so far, at least, the evidence is fairly thin that the link economy can support the kind of numbers of reporters and independent journalists doing the verified journalism that I think that we believe a society needs. Where do you see that going, and do you foresee the link economy, as it's called, really generating the kind of revenue that journalists have traditionally depend upon?
A, I do, and B, I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that this great legacy journalistic enterprise that we all rightly revere in many ways failed to report on the two major stories of our time. The war in Iraq, the lead up to the war in Iraq was really missed by most of those legacy reporters, many of whom were more concerned with getting access than with getting to the facts. And so, of course, was the financial meltdown. And the question of access is incredibly important. Howard Kurtz wrote a really interesting piece last week about what's happening right now with political reporters scrambling to get access to White House players, because that's the way then for them to get huge book advances. I mean, as we found out from the Game Change authors, you know, who are now getting $5 million for their next book. And we saw that, of course, with Bob Woodward. Right. You know, Bob Woodward was the sort of the ultimate example of somebody who wrote two books, big advances on George Bush's early years, which completely missed the story of what was happening, but gave us great reporting on how many mints were on the table during the cabinet meetings, and all these kind of things that made you feel you're a fly on the wall. While in fact, he was selling his own journalistic independence for access. So that's a very real danger that legacy reporters need to guard against. And that's where the kind of the reporting that includes citizen journalism, that includes social media, that includes, you know, the linked economy, can be sort of a countervailing force against.
Great. Questions? Can you step up to the microphone?
My name is My name is Chandrakant Pancholi, Overseas India Weekly. Can you predict the future of print media? Is it a fracture, or it is on a deathbed and will be gone? And with millions of websites coming up, how will you decide about accuracy and propaganda? And on another side, can you tell me what effect Osho, Acharya Rajneesh had on your life and in your spirituality?
So your last question was about?
Acharya Rajneesh, about the spiritual guru that you had.
My spiritual guru. Okay.
And how it affected your life and work, if it did. Okay. And what was so unique about it?
Well, let me start with your question about print media. I don't see it at all as an either or. I don't see that it's going to be print media or online media. I see a hybrid future when I look into my crystal ball, where print media are doing those that survive and thrive are doing a better and better job at covering what's happening, at having their readers participate and develop a story, which more and more readers want to do. And I see online media adopting the best of traditional media, which for me are fairness, accuracy, fact-checking. These are the best traditions of journalism. And the best of online media are going to be increasingly adopting those. And of course, original reporting. So I see this as a hybrid future. I see a kind of convergence, which is already happening and will only accelerate. I also see more and more investigative journalism being not-for-profit. And we see that at the local level too. We see sites like Voice of San Diego or Huffington Post, which are breaking great local stories. And they are largely not-for-profit operations. So I'm very optimistic about the future. And I just think the only operations that are going to be in trouble are those that are trying to pretend that they can go back to the past and are not accepting the disruptive innovation that is now part of the present and will be part of the future. In terms of my own spirituality, that has always been a big part of my life ever since I was a little girl growing up in Athens, Greece. I actually spent a few amazing months in India when I was 17 at Shantiniketan University outside Calcutta, studying comparative religion, and wrote a book called The Fourth Instinct that is about our instinct for spirituality and meaning in our lives. So that has been a big part in my life, and everything that I'm interested in somehow finds its way into the Huffington Post. So we have two sections at the moment, a living section and a section on religion that address this quest that more and more people are interested in.
Thank you. And actually, I see we have a lot of people lined up, so we may have to cut it off at the last person in line if we want to be on schedule, but why don't you go ahead?
Kalimera.
This is Greek for those.
I really want to thank you for your insightful comments, but also your really upbeat, positive outlook. My name is Mel Brown. I'm with the Malian Cultural Center. And I remember, just a short comment, I remember in August of 2000, I was in a restaurant in Brooklyn, and I turned to a colleague of mine and says, you know what? I feel like I'm living in Weimar. That the only difference between Bush and Gore was that Bush would need a war. Gore could use one. And I said to myself, you know, listening to you, I'm trying to figure out what kind of international reach we can have. Because I remember the days since the Bush administration that I would only read the Financial Times because I wanted to see international coverage. And good, smart money looks like they're going to Asia and to Africa. And I wanted to know how you navigate the dialogue with your readers about educating ourselves to where smart money is going, where that international reach is, so that we can have real economic development.
Well, Actually, it's interesting to see where the smart money is going, because one of the things that's happening at the moment, if you look at Afghanistan, is that China is putting a lot of resources there, but instead of putting a lot of resources the way we are doing, they are putting a lot of resources but in ways that can support their own economy and actually earn them a lot of friends in Afghanistan. So we are acting like a declining empire that still thinks the way to win friends is to put massive military resources into a country, kill innocent civilians on what appears to be a weekly basis at the moment, and miss the point of where the real threats are coming from, which are widespread all around the world, including coming from within America itself. So I think there is a real disconnect at the moment between where our real interests are and where our resources are going internationally.
Next.
Hi, I'm Marcia Kuntz from Media Matters for America. I wanted to go back to what you said, Arianna, about the need to cover the middle class. And I completely agree that the suffering of the middle class is an issue that must get a lot of attention. But I also think an area in which the mainstream media have failed in this coverage of the economy is to make the connection between the suffering of the middle class and the behavior of Wall Street and the need for financial regulatory reform on Wall Street. The behavior of Wall Street is what I think in part created this crisis for the middle class by creating massive incentives on the part of mortgage lenders to make loans to people who couldn't afford them on terms that they couldn't meet, with the moral hazard of them not having any responsibility for checking the creditability of these people, because they would then sell the loans into the secondary market immediately. So there was no check on that. And I'm wondering how you tackle that problem of making the connection between the suffering of the middle class and the need for real regulatory reform. I mean, some of these issues are tangential, executive pay, for example, but some aren't. Some are directly related to the causes of the crisis.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that is really at the heart of our coverage. And it's not just what Wall Street did, it's also what government did. It's what the Fed did and failed to do. It's the lack of oversight. It's what government agencies like the SEC failed to do. So the problems are widespread. And that's why the key here is repetition. I mean, unfortunately, we've all discovered that just writing something does not change anything if you don't stay on it. And that's one of the great and good differences between what's happening online and what's often happening in print media. We've had major stories throughout the years break on the front pages of the New York Times and die there. And the good news about online media is that while often print media suffer from ADD, we suffer from OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So we stay with the story and we stay with the story and develop it and advance it. And that's the way you can break through the static and actually wake people up about what's happening. So we definitely do that and want to do more and more of it.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Kanehira. I'm a Japanese journalist. I'm working for a Japanese TV station for more than 30 years. And also in Japan, the mainstream media are now almost dying. And last night I read through the book, new published book, The Life and Death of American Journalism. And what would you say the idea that all news reporting should ultimately should be non-profit, not commercial based?
Well, I don't think, again, it's either or. I think that you can have both. I mean, in our case, the Huffington Post is for profit, and the Huffington Post Investigative Fund is not for profit. So I think that you can have both. I mean, as we said, advertising is moving online, maybe not as fast as we would like, but it is moving online. So there's absolutely no reason not to do both. You know, again, to make a larger point, what we are writing about, and certainly what the Huffington Post's editorial stance is not anti-capitalist. Free enterprise capitalist system is still the best system invented, but it's not what we have right here. What we have is an oligarchic system of socialized losses and privatized gains, and that's really the problem. That's what we are criticizing, and the need to redefine and reinvent capitalism is what is critical. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Diane Bach. I write for Chelsea Now, a local paper, and I blog for Women's Voices for Change and Comedy Beat. And I'm curious to something you said in the beginning, that you didn't believe in paywalls. We know that good reporting takes money. There are international bureaus that major outlets are closing all over the world because they don't have the money to keep them up. Bloggers draw on the initial reporting done by outlets such as the New York Times. So how, without that kind of resource, without, say, an organ like the New York Times to gather that kind of information, what can the bloggers do, number one, and could you say a little more about why we shouldn't, as online readers who are reading the same thing in the Times that we read when we paid for the paper, why shouldn't we pay for it online?
Oh, I don't think it's a question of should or should not. I mean, I'm talking about an economic decision. It's not a moral decision about whether people should or should not pay. I'm saying that all the evidence and all the surveys that have been done show that consumers are not willing to pay in large enough numbers to make paywalls work. This is a purely pragmatic decision. It's not an ideological one. And this is why we at the Huffington Post are not going to have paywalls. Every other company is going to make its own decision. And also, I'm a great believer, as I said from the beginning, in the vital importance, especially right now, of investigative journalism. But that is a public good that very often will have to be supported through not-for-profit operations, the way we support universities or museums or medical institutions. So we're all going to get used to doing more and more of that. And we also see the great way of reporting international news that we saw, for example, during the Iran uprising, which is what citizens are doing. And that is going to be increasingly important, especially as authoritarian regimes are cracking down on mainstream media.
Hi, I think I'm last.
Well, actually, we're going to
okay,
allow the two gentlemen behind you.
All right.
Yes, so.
Well, as being close to last, I wanted to say thank you. I blog for the Huffington Post, and I have for a couple of years. And I think I started about when the entertainment section started, so it has been a great experience. I guess my question is, now that the Huffington Post is so big and kind of grown up, and there are more buzzy voices and bigger names, and it seems like everybody, rightly so, wants to add their voice to the Huffington Post. How do you find a balance between names, not names, voices who have something to say, but might not be well-known voices? How are you finding that?
Well, really, that is a very important balance, because one of the things that we've loved to do from the beginning is act like an audition platform. For people who may not have a name, who are just starting out often, or at whatever age that is, and who can be discovered on the Huffington Post. One of my favorite things is getting calls from agents saying, how do we reach so-and-so, or can you give us a number for so-and-so? And we all our editors love that. So that's going to continue to be a great priority for us, including giving a platform for young people. We have teenagers writing on the Huffington Post. We just launched a college section where we are working with about 70 colleges, including Columbia, around the country. And again, providing a megaphone for a lot of the great work being done by young people around America.
Thank you.
Hi, Arianna. My name is Sam Feldman. I'm a graduate student at the Journalism School. I had a question about the hybrid economy and the linked economy, as you said. In the future, the next crisis, the continuing trend of repertorial resources at the legacy media dropping, do you see that the Huffington Post and other sites like it within the linked economy are going to be able to educate and warn about the next crisis before it strikes?
Well, that's what we are trying to do right now, because whether we're going to prevent the new crisis depends on what we do right now. And I must say I'm delighted to see that one of my heroes, Joe Stiglitz, is here, because he's been sounding this prophetic voice for a long time. And these are the kind of voices that we need to amplify and to basically make constantly available. It's that this constant repetition and development of a point of view that matters, that is going to break through the static and sound the alarm bells and wake people up in sufficient time to do something about it. And the window is open right now, but it's not going to be open indefinitely.
Hi, I'm Reg Chua with the South China Morning Post. To get back to the question of the linked economy, and as you say, I take your point about, let's get ideology out of it. It's not whether you should pay, it's whether people will pay and what the economic factors are. You've spoken of the linked economy, which as far as I can see is essentially the online advertising economy. That's a revenue stream. You've talked about nonprofits funding some reporting. That's another revenue stream. Do you see any other revenue streams? Will subscription revenues ever be a meaningful revenue stream as far as journalism is concerned? Do you see, service-based fees? Do you see? I mean, are we in an age where we're looking at essentially just two main revenue streams, or do you see other things evolving?
Well, I think there are always going to be many experimentations. I mean, this is a great age for experimenting, and it depends on the scale of what you're doing. There could be niche sites that can be subscription-based because of what they're providing. All that experimentation is going on right now and will continue to go on. I think one of the things that we need to come to terms with is that for millions of people right now, self-expression is the new entertainment. So when many people in legacy media look around and they say, why are people updating Wikipedia entries for free? Why are people sending reports from around America on what's happening for free? People really have a hard time recognizing that's something people love to do. They want to be part of their story of their time. They want to tell stories. They want to comment on stories. They want to share stories. And for years, nobody said, why are people watching bad TV from their couches for 7 hours for free? Nobody asked that question. So now that we have many couch potatoes transformed into participants, into observers, into witnesses, there is this huge outcry of why is that happening, as though somehow they're being exploited. And legacy media have a lot of trouble understanding that need, although they are learning fast. When we had the terrorist attack in Russia, last week, the New York Times actually put an ask out to the Russian readers to participate in telling that story.
That was very effective. Yeah.
Which was extremely effective. So it's not something that only digital natives like the Huffington Post can do. Anybody can do it. And my hope is that more and more of the legacy media are going to do more and more of that, which will lead to greater reporting. And I want to invite all of you to participate in that. I mean, I'm going to give you my email address, and if you want to write for the Huffington Post, if there is a story you want to tell, if you have a child that wants to tell a story, please say it on the Huffington Post. That's what we want to provide, that kind of platform. And my email address is arianna@huffingtonpost.com. Yes.
Last question.
Thank you. My name is Hugh McGuire. My experience with the online world is that it is shortening attention spans. And I was wondering if, well, you remember the long articles that used to appear in the New York Times Magazine or the New Yorker Magazine. That seems to be a thing of the past. How has your writing style evolved from the print journalism to online journalism? Has it affected how you structure a sentence in a paragraph or in how you focus the information you want to communicate?
Well, sometimes it does, depending on what I'm writing. First of all, I've written 12 books, and I'm now in the process of writing my 13th book on the decline of the middle class. So I'm not giving up on long form. And we have a book section at the Huffington Post that we are doing in partnership with the New York Review of Books. So we're definitely not giving up on books. It's not either or. There are times when you want to do a quick hit, just a quick response or a quick thought, and that's where the short form writing comes in. And there are times where when you need the longer form. I don't know if Michael Spies is here, but Michael, yes. Michael had a great idea that we are going to do together about, which he proposed to me yesterday, about going in and actually doing a long form story on, for example, a family having their home foreclosed, but being there with them, not just reporting on it, but kind of almost living it with them, and being able to bring people into the story as it is occurring so that we can create these characters that can change the way we see what's happening in the country. That long-form writing, I agree, has not been happening enough. We want to do more of it. It's the way you can capture a human story and bring a human dimension to a story that otherwise becomes about data and figures and facts and can lose the public in the process.
I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you very much, Arianna. This was great.